things stay as they are, civilizations will end, and that should be shocking enough for to take it, to take it much more seriously than we are.
In your documentary, The BirthGap, you kind of are surprised by how falling fertility rates wasn't a widespread mainstream issue. Has that changed in the years since then? Are more people talking about it? Is it more prevalent?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I started in, exactly 8 years ago, early 2016. At that time, one of the alarm bells for me was no one knows about this. No one's even talking about it. I actually, at that time, got so concerned that people weren't talking about it. I contacted some major newspapers, mainly in the UK, saying, do you know what's happening with birth rates across all of Europe? And it was at the time that Brexit was happening. People were about to vote. I thought people really should know about low birth rates in Germany and Italy and Spain, because it may be a factor. Frankly, it is a big factor economically. And the response I got from newspaper, their editorial desk was, this doesn't matter, or no one cares about this, or one said, people already know about this. This is a non-deal. So where we've moved really in the years since then is one where it's becoming effectively mainstream. I still think most people don't yet know about it or don't know of the significance of it. But it's pleasing, at least, that now it's become topical in the sense that it's in the news. I still don't believe we prioritize it anywhere. Well, we don't. I mean, this is a shocking thing that's going to effectively, it's civilization ending, and if things stay as they are, civilizations will end. And that should be shocking enough to take it, to take it much more seriously than we are. But at least it's in the news. So we've accomplished step one, but there's quite a lot more to go.
The way it kind of sounds there is you kind of feel a bit maybe almost insane. You're like, wait, look, are people not kind of seeing the issue here? And was that kind of scary at the time? How did that feel?
Gosh, it really did feel scary. It felt like, why is it only me? Why only I know this? Of course, you would read some things. There'd be some fairly obscure books on the topic that were not well read by demographers, more academic than anything. Some papers, the odd little comment that you would see somewhere. And what was almost more depressing was that when it was highlighted, fertility rates fall again in Japan, and then the next paragraph would be about Japan's quirky culture that means it's a Japan problem. And then you read the same thing for Italy and Spain, and it was a youth unemployment problem. And all of these, were kind of tucked away as kind of, understandable reasons because of what's going on in those nations. But when you actually look at the data, no, this was a global problem, and it was spreading. And the one day I got some respite from my worry, I remember, was, it would have been 2016, early on. I was going through searching for videos on this topic, and lo and behold, there was Elon Musk on CNN. I was, oh my gosh, it's not just me. There's somebody else with a much bigger voice than I have who also understands what's happening. And I think at that moment I felt, okay, there's hope. We just got to keep, telling the message. And the documentary, I was never planning to make a documentary. That's a story in itself, but that came about as possibly a good way to at least communicate to the world what's actually happening.
I like that. The reason I like the documentary so much is I've kind of been thinking a lot. So I do economics, and about how data can be really helpful, but I don't think we should rely just on data because, as you say, you could, in each different country, of Japan or Italy, you could try and explain it away. But if you talk to individuals and you get the life story of someone on the ground experiencing it, at a certain point, you kind of, I think that economics can kind of stray too far away from like on the ground. What are people experiencing? So, I wonder if you could, I kind of wanted to ask about that, is it women? Is it men? To get into the difficult problem of why this is occurring, sort of, what are people saying about why they're not having as many children?
Yeah, so just on the data point first, you're absolutely right. I've been running a data science company for 25 years, and we we do a fair amount of data analytics on demographic level data, mainly in the US. And we've all the tools available. I have access to wonderful academics who are able to contribute their latest modeling techniques. And yet, when you look at demographics, this is a topic that is not niche. It affects every nation. It goes to the heart of not just economics, but also socioeconomics of every nation. It also impacts us personally in our lives and our communities. We're not short of demographers. And yet, when I looked at it, it was obvious to me that no one had come up with any connection that was meaningful to explain what's going on. And that was the most bizarre thing. I mean, why would it be that with all of this data, there's no shortage of data, there's no shortage of countries to analyze, there's no shortage of brain power, why do we still not know the answer to this? And to your point, my first reaction was, we're not talking to people. We need to sit down and talk to a lot of people in different places before we even start to come up with some hypothesis as to what might be the reason. Sure, we can correlate. We can correlate anything we want if we try hard enough. And that's been done, but to me, all those correlations fail because to me, it was obvious this is a global trend. Obvious in the sense of the probability that it's not, when you see something starting in multiple countries at the same time, early 70s, but not all countries. And over time, it never kind of reverts to a prior state. It only progresses more and more and more and more. And then those countries that did have higher birth rates, they follow the same trend. So to try and imagine this is down to local factors was just a non-starter for me. And that led to my decision, okay, let's go and let's sit down with people. I originally planned to spend a year, not full-time, but to allocate as much time as I could going to Europe, 5-6 countries, and to Japan. I thought, let's see if we can come up with some common story that might serve the basis of a possible hypothesis. So actually, it took a year and a half before I even came up with my hypothesis. I mean, literally, it was just listening to people and trying to come up with some connection. And on the face of it, there were no connections. You look at education in Japan, it's very expensive. Education in Germany is free. Childcare in one country would be high, low in another. Paternity, maternity leave were 1 year combined in Denmark with a low birth rate, and very little in Japan by comparison. So I was able to actually strike off many things that could be causal until I came down to an anomaly. It wasn't even a hypothesis at that time, it was an anomaly. And you see it in part 1 of the documentary, where I realized almost everybody I'm meeting, if they're young, they have brothers and sisters. Sometimes many. One Japanese woman, she was one of 8. And okay, exceptions happen, but after a year and a half of asking people at that point, it was probably 10 or 12 countries. The preponderance of people being singletons was very low. And the hypothesis then evolved to, okay, my hypothesis is low birth rates are not caused by shrinking family size. They're caused by childlessness. Because the only way to get a birth rate of less than 2 is a large number of people having either one child or none. And it wasn't one child, was my hypothesis. So it was then a case, another year went by after that, trying to figure out, well, how do you have the childlessness? Very difficult thing to conceptualize. And it's because you can't go out and just ask people, are you childless? Because by definition, many people are childless up to a certain moment in time when they have a child. And people don't necessarily know if they're childless, if they want a child, whether they will have a child in future if they're still in those years when it's possible. So that I then understood, okay, the reason we don't understand this is because it's a little bit of a sensitive topic, and I think a lot of people might not want to go there in terms of childlessness. There are different reasons for it, and how can you ascertain whether people are childless because they want to be or cannot medically have a child, or because life takes its own course in a different direction. So that then became my hypothesis. And that's a very long answer to get to the second part of your question, which is what's going on. Well, having done all that and having looked at data for 50 or 60 countries, data that's available from the UN in terms of birth patterns, the age and the timing of when people are having children, it's very obvious that indeed family size has not changed for decades, and childlessness is the reason. So we don't have a birth rate problem in terms of births per woman. We actually have a childlessness issue, and put those two components together: children per mother staying the same, and childlessness rocketing, and you get our low birth rates. So childlessness is the issue.
Yeah, it makes me think that I kind of asked the wrong question, because I said why people are having less, because then it's not. It's I guess you might say something like people are maybe having the same, they're still having, if they decide to have children, they might have similar family sizes, but then there are many people that just decide to have none. And it's interesting, you talk about it being a kind of silent kind of issue, because people might want kids but not be able to have them, or they, if, they might have kids at some point, so you can't just, start questioning them,
Yeah.
Why don't you have kids? They might.
Yeah, and you said decide there, so I have to just flag that for 1 second. The vast majority of people who don't have children, there was no decision. It just, life, ended up that way. Some do decide, but you're right, it's very hard to survey. So, people may decide in their younger years they don't want kids, and then age 30 they meet someone. This thing called love happens, and before you know it, the idea of a child, then becomes a strong desire. So it's we're looking at a time series here, and the only thing about time series, they're complicated, certainly from a modeling point of view. So there was a non-obvious, there is a non-obvious way to kind of derive all this, which is looking at the patterns of those who are having children and when they're having them, and then from that, because we know the totality of society, looking at therefore who are not having children and the timing of that. So it all, if I can talk economics a little bit, you're the economist here much more than me. I have studied a little bit, but certainly no expert. But it's interesting that economic crises have been the things very often to actually trigger childlessness. So this was the first real aha moment. We're not talking of a slow trend towards people not having children. You might imagine that would be the case based on a lot of what you hear in the media these days. But no, this goes back. We can go back to 1971 and the Nixon shock in the US. We can go back actually to the late 60s in Germany, 68, around the time of a lot of civil strife around the student protests. And then very clearly we can tie it in Japan and Italy and the UK actually to the 1973 oil shock. So if we look at these crises and we look at what actually happened, so take Japan as an example. In Japan in 1973, childlessness was around 4 or 5%. Very low. Italy, we can put in the table too, because childlessness there was even less. It was around 3-4%. Those countries are remarkably similar in terms of the data itself. So it's not a Japan thing or an Italy thing. So let's take those two countries. For both those nations, within 3 years, childlessness had reached 20%, and within a few more years had gone up over 30%, and now in both cases is touching 40%. But the first, transition is a transition to childlessness really happened within a 3-year window. Now, if you narrow it down, you can actually see to the individual month or quarter really after the oil shock, where childlessness just suddenly kicked in. Literally going from 3-4% up to 15%, on up to 22%. And demographics don't change like that. And then when you look, well, who were these people suddenly not having children? Everybody. It was rural and urban, but it was very much focused on to be clear, the oil shock itself had only an impact on people who didn't have children, who otherwise would have had them. And how can we say they would otherwise have had them? Because if you look historically, you can see these very low childlessness rates. We know how many people by age group would be expected to, have a baby in a given year. And we see 74, 1 year after the oil shock, a sudden drop in the number of births. And then you look at, well, who were the mothers who were having children? And it's actually, the proportion of mothers having, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 10 in the case of Japan, we got that data. It didn't change at all. If you already had your first child, you were still going to go on to have your second to third, third to fourth. No change in that structure, no move, but a huge delay in those who did not have a child. And one thing that's actually interesting, and this is a theory I have, because it did take about a quarter. So it was like 12, not 9 months, but around 12 months after the oil shock, this really kicked in. And I think it was those people who are already committed to trying to have a baby, that everything was already aligned. They had their finances, everything was secure more often than not. And indeed, they, continued to have the baby they were planning to have. Now, what I suspect is that for those who weren't quite at that point, because of the financial crises at that moment in time, there was a thought process of, well, maybe we should just wait a little bit. Let's just wait and see what happens. There might be a better time given uncertainty. And within the data itself, what you see is people shifting from having babies in early 20s at that time would have been common to more and more late 20s into 30s. And by definition, the time window available to have a child, particularly as a woman, but actually it's both, because you need to be in a couple, certainly you did in the 70s. The available time window to meet that partner, settle down, not break up, that's another thing as well. You may be in a partnership in early 20s, but you might not become your early 30s. All of those things started to kind of unravel. So to come back to your point, I could talk about this a lot. I don't know how much detail you want to go into, but there's a lot of evidence that actually this was a baby shock. And I'll bring it up to date. The exact same thing happened in the US and Malaysia, Netherlands, Ireland, multiple countries, Canada, 07, 08, right after the mortgage crisis shock. So you see these shocks and you see the sudden readjustment. And I shouldn't leave it there. I should just put on the table the one other important fact about all of this is that it never reverts after the oil shocks, after people kind of go back to living in relative wealth or relative people today certainly are struggling. I think people always have struggled, but relatively the crisis is over. Why does it never unwind? Well, that's an open question, but it seems to be that once societal norms change, once it becomes the done thing amongst your friend group, against your brothers, sisters, to have children into your 30s, so that's kind of what we all do, and we use our 20s for other things like getting on the career ladder, and it becomes a risk to a child earlier. So the whole thing, in terms of data, in terms of the reason, was a shift towards delayed parenthood, triggered, not caused, but triggered by financial crises around the world.
Interesting. Like, if I understand it, when you have these kinds of shocks, even if, it's not necessarily that people decide, okay, now I don't want to have kids, there's too much uncertainty, but it's just any delay means that on average you're going to have people that suddenly it's like slightly too late. It's interesting because I talked to this evolutionary psychologist who we discussed how, in a way, often having children is kind of especially in an evolutionary past, you wouldn't have planned it that much. You just kind of happen and you go, okay, now we have kids and you're happy for it. But so it's almost like another kind of additional dilemma in all this is that we can kind of plan and control it so much, and so we see a shock and we'll be like, well, there's no risk here, we will just decide to do it later. And so I'm just trying to think why these shocks cause such a problem. Is it the fact that you just skew people to being older, and then like people, they wanted to have kids but now they can't? Also, yeah. You mentioned there as well, if less, the more and more times you get shocks and you have people delaying things, that just sort of also sets norms, interestingly. So now you're just having people around you having kids later, and that kind of changes the dynamics.
Yeah. Well, if it were the case that we could successfully, with reasonable certainty, kids into our 40s, I don't think we'd be in this perfect crisis. So people run out of time, and I'm actually not even talking about the medical, fertility decline that I shouldn't say medical, that's slightly different, but the full fertility that women have, from their late 20s through their 40s. That's important, very important, but there's a bigger factor in all of this, which is that an event has to happen before you have a baby, before you even think of having a baby. You need a partner. Most often, that's the ideal state that people are looking for, to be in a partnership. And only once you've accomplished finding that partner and settling down, whatever that might mean, are you then able to say, okay, we now would like to go ahead to the next step. So that there are actually two events here, not independent necessarily, but one is a precursor to the other. Now, what tends to happen is that once we get into our 30s, which may more or not be the ideal time to have a child for many, things can go wrong. And that might be a case of not finding a partner. That's the case for many. Breaking up, that happens a lot too. Divorces happen, breakups happen when you thought you had the partner, you've been dating for 5 years, 7 years, it seemed perfect, and then suddenly no. Or your partner is not at that point. You need both of you to be on the same page at the same time to say this is right. And often it be a case of, well, from a career point of view, from finance point of view, let's just wait. So the likelihood of being in the right position to contemplate having children meaningfully, it doesn't get easier in our 30s to have those things line up. Now, in terms of the actual mechanics of this, there's a huge lack of awareness, and that's part of what I'm doing now. I'm trying to increase awareness. There's a huge lack of awareness of how the odds stack against us. So one thing, having defined how we can measure childlessness, we can actually measure now the point in time when, for example, there would only be a 50% likelihood of ever becoming a mother. It's easier with women than men because there's so much data from hospital records. It's both really. So in all of the countries I've looked at, by age 30, a woman without a child at most has a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother. Half. Now, in a survey I did, I asked 200 young American women, non-scientific, but just to get a sense of it, what age they thought women would have a 50% likelihood of ever becoming a mother. 40 was the most common answer. 35 was the next most common answer. And another example, I've had physicians kind of challenge me, saying, no, people can have children, much later. It's like, yeah, technically, yes, that's true, but there's a lot of other things that need to happen in life as well, and it's just not happening clearly. I think, to answer your question about do people give up? No, I don't think so. I think it's completely the opposite. People start to stress about this a lot. For those who do want children, I should say, I try and say in all podcasts, I completely, passionately respect those who choose not to have children. It's a small minority. It's only 5 to 7%. No one should coerce people who don't want the children to have them. So, that's a given for me. But for those who are left childless, and it's a vast majority, we're looking at 40% childlessness in Italy and, Japan and many countries heading towards that number. We're looking at something like 80% of childless people had planned to be parents. That's huge. And it's not that they just give up until a certain moment in time. And if I can say, making a documentary, having come up with this, hypothesis, and then proven the hypothesis is valid, that it's childlessness through vast amounts of raw data without exception in all these countries. At that point, I was probably 2 to 3 years into making the documentary, and we were about to go to Latin America to film. I thought, okay, this time I'm not just going to talk to young people, I'm going to talk to childless people in their 40s and 50s, because my expectation would be I'm going to find these people. I'm going to find the vast majority of people who are childless had wanted to have a child. And it's why you see in the documentary there's quite a few women, Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers from Latin America, talking about their unplanned childlessness. And beyond that, I interviewed people in the US and Japan and other countries. I don't think I did in Europe. I think I'd already finished filming in Europe before kind of that penny dropped. That was the reason. But that was further evidence that absolutely. And many of these women who were opening up to me about their grief, that's the term they use, grief being childless, had never told anybody before. This is a very personal, very internalized, sad, deep grief in many cases. And then I discovered the online support groups for men and women, and connected with those people who were so gracious at kind of, enlightening me on really how tough it can be if you had planned to be a parent and living a life like it.
Yeah, and that's great. And to riff on that, I mean, in the documentary, it's fascinating to see how, as you say, it's not just you don't have kids, but I mean, if you go into it late in your 30s and then you break up with a partner, you realize your partner doesn't want kids, it's really helpful that you would bring in those life circumstances. And I know, like, the podcaster Chris Williamson, talked a lot about like dating in young people and like how difficult is it to get a relationship. And it's not that it's impossible or anything, but if you just make it slightly harder than at the time when people might want to get into a relationship and decide they want to have kids, and then there's that barrier, and you just increase the likelihood, right? And then even on the point there of it's not like it's impossible to have kids when you're older, but the odds kind of start stacking against you, and it's those unforeseen circumstances. It's fascinating you bring up the grief. It's something I guess I'm 22, and you kind of feel like there's no way that could happen, and it's life is it's too long, and surely if I want to, I'll be able to have them, right? But I assume it probably sneaks up on you. So
I let's say in the next year or two, I don't know your situation. We don't need to talk about you personally here, but I'm generalizing because I've got kids around your age. Let's say you meet the love of your life, but you're not ready to settle down and get married.
At this point, Stephen Shaw had a power cut, and so the next section just skips into when we started talking once again, and so hopefully it's not too jarring.
I think a way to look at it, I would say to anybody, you cannot assume that you're going to have multiple opportunities to have a child. No one can. And if there is that one person that you would have a child with, you really got to ask yourself, if you want to take the risk of, trying to find someone else. The stories I could tell you, the breakups, the couple that broke up thinking, well, let's just break up for a couple of years because we're still too young and let's get back together again. Then one had a child in the interim. And then, why did you do that for? It's like, well, I don't know. There's a lot of things that can get in the way of planning, and that's hard. That's really hard for younger people. But that's what happens. People get into their late 20s, 30s, still assuming, well, I've probably got time, and then realizing they maybe don't.
And in how you're thinking about what solutions might be to these problems, are you yourself trying to think about it in what people need to do more personally on an individual level? Because I suppose as an economist, we want to find these big structural factors if the government only does this or that. So what did you think of the interplay is between big factors versus the individual lives?
No, I think really what economists ought to be focusing on, frankly, is how societies can cope with the inevitable, because we know we are heading towards increasing aging societies, increasingly aging, and we're going to have to cope with the horrors of that economically, of supporting so many older people with fewer taxpayers. In terms of economics being able to help solve this problem, it goes much broader than economics. Does economics have a role? I'm not sure it does even. You can point policies in multiple countries now. We've got 5 decades of countries trying to solve this problem economically, and there's been no success anywhere. A slight caveat is a caveat for Hungary, which has a raft of policies that have been designed to increase birth rates, and that has happened quite significantly, but they're still quite low at around 1.6, and their policies go far beyond economic. It's more of a country that has put family, first. I mean, literally, you arrive at the airport and it's last brass little plaque saying family friendly Hungary. You get a real sense that Hungary is a country where it's perhaps the norm to think of having a child in your 20s. So I'm not convinced that it's even the economic measures that they've introduced that have been greatly responsible for that. So, one of the grateful things that we have in countries like Japan and Korea and Scandinavia and Italy is that they've tried these economic measures and really, they've shown that frankly our money could be good things as they may be. It may be great to open up more kindergartens. I'm sure it is. More paid time off. Great for many people, but we cannot assume that that's going to impact our career.
Fascinating that a lot of government policies don't work, and culture might, but how do you change that, right, on the individual, and then local, and as you get bigger, if especially as it's almost these feedback loops, because if you have families in neighborhoods that have fewer kids, then I think I talked to an evolutionary psychologist about, if you just have fewer kids and fewer people out playing, then it's just less appealing to have another kid, right? There's who they play out with, and COVID kind of made that worse. Kind of people doing more things indoors, which it can be helpful, but in other ways it's just sort of reducing those incentives. And I wonder, I mean, so there it kind of sounded like, do you think it's too late to actually kind of solve the problem on a large level?
Is it too late? Well, it's too late to prop up our economies based on the current economic model, given that for example, let's take the UK. In the UK last year, 900,000 people celebrated their 50th birthday, but less than 700,000 babies were born. That's a 200,000 deficit in 1 year, 23% decline. That will lead to fewer potential future parents, which will, and the UK is actually not the worst in this by any means, but I worry that the UK is catching up with countries in Southern Europe, Japan, Korea, etc. But more generally, is it too late? No. If we readjust for the reality that we are going to be heading towards smaller populations, it's hard to see now, but that is going to happen. If enough young people, frankly your age, take it upon themselves that they do want children, it's a big if, but I actually become quite an optimist. Having shown the documentary at quite a number of colleges, universities, events, it's quite moving to see the strength of opinion, the shock, frankly, from young people when they hear that, well, what do you mean I might end up childless? And they see, they hear the stories of those people in their 40s, 50s who have unintentionally ended up childless. I think what I'm hoping for here is a rise in awareness among people your age, that if you don't try to form families younger than those a little bit older than you have traditionally been doing in recent decades, that you may also fall into the category. And most people want kids. Most people want kids quite strongly when it comes down to it. So it's too late to save the current structures of society. That worries me. But it's not too late to save civilizations, and those are the terms we need to be thinking on this.
It's interesting because, in a way, I mean, sometimes I think about it how when people are having fewer kids nowadays, it's kind of become, the traditional family structure of, say, the 60s. People is in a way a kind of rebellion. I mean, you can actually, I can decide to live for myself and I don't need to have kids. But I sometimes wonder that these kind of, if there's ebbs and flows in these cycles, because now if so many people are not having kids, it can kind of be the rebellious move to actually say, no, I want to have kids. And as you point out, I mean, I've kind of been seeing that too. I mean, there's a young economist my age who, frankly, much better than me, who's focusing on these kinds of issues, and improving meta science and just these structural issues within our institutions. So it's fascinating that the kind of is kind of, I mean, it's funny because people having kids sort of, people, biologically speaking, like, it's interesting, what is the optimal age? I mean, I don't know, but it's probably like much younger than when people have kids nowadays. We sort of so deeply entrenched in our own culture that I wonder, in our evolutionary past, maybe we'd be having kids, like in our early 20s, and that's kind of unheard of even nowadays. Yeah.
On that point, in the documentary, you'll hear from, I believe, 4 fertility doctors, and they all were sharing the same thing. When I sat down with these doctors, it was to find out, what are the hopes, if you like, for extending the fertility window. What are the hopes from IVF, technology improvements, egg freezing, etc. And universally, they were downbeat. And quite emotionally, in a couple of cases, that the stories they see, or the patients they have to work with, but in the end, very often, I think most often, not succeeding. They think there's a huge disparity between what our expectations are, what these technologies can do in terms of extending our fertility, versus the reality of what nature has dictated upon us. And there are 3 key things that they explained to me. One is that quantity. A woman, a girl is born with all the eggs that she will ever have, and no eggs are ever created outside once the child is born. Now, the quantity of eggs produced every month reduces over time. The quality of those eggs deteriorates over time, and the ability to carry a baby to term decreases over time. So we have 3 different factors going against us here. Now, men have issues too, and it is pointed out often that we talk more about women than men, but I'm not going to paint myself as any expert here, but let's just say, I think 8 to 10% of issues directly relate to men. And about 30 to 40% are unknown, and about 50% are women. Now, the unknowns are unknown by definition, but the hint I got from a doctor is usually that's due to egg quality rather than anything else. So, men do have issues here as well, but it's clear that women's fertility falls off much quicker than I think we believe. And of course, we hear the news stories about someone age 50 give birth recently. But by definition, that's news. It's the exception, and we can't take great comfort on these exceptions. So, I think nature's there, and changing nature. We can read about all these things, from technologies to surrogacy to artificial wombs, etc. It's not going to help most of us. Most of us, if we're going to have children, we'll do it the natural way or not. So I would be fighting against nature. I just want to comment on your point about rebelling against I have not yet seen in the data so far a great movement towards abstinence from wanting to have children. I think this may be quite a recent trend, though, based on social media trends in the past few years that may yet be through the system. I still believe, though, that many of those people who are saying, as teenagers, early 20s, that they don't want kids, once they meet someone, that might change. I equally worry that for many people, they will be almost fooled out of believing that they want kids and end up childless. So that has to be a worry.
Yeah, and on that point of, do you actually want kids or not, right? It kind of evolves as you get older. I was talking to an economist who he did it with developing countries, but the fact that people rationalized their choices. So if they had free kids, they'll say they wanted free kids. And you can try and think about do some random variation, see like if you give randomly people more kids, yeah, they will say they wanted to have those additional kids. And in some ways we kind of argued, are they like tricking themselves? Are they like just rationalizing it? Is it not a good thing? But then sometimes I wonder, like, it's you can't logically think through having kids. So when you actually have them and you change, maybe you actually do genuinely. It's not a sort of an economics like misinformation. You've just changed your preferences for no reason. Or maybe like quite genuinely you had kids and now you want them. It's fascinating because again, you kind of it's something, and we often, maybe again with the fact that we can plan it so much, we didn't have to kind of think so hard about it. If it just happened, and then we kind of, it's biologically trained into us that we want to do it.
Sure. Well, I don't know when the optimal time to have a child is, but it certainly is younger than we're having them today. And by definition, if you have a child younger, you have the opportunity to have more children, whether you plan to or not. Demographers are pretty much unified on what they call the first demographic transition, which you mentioned the 60s, goes back to around then and prior. And we still see it in parts of Africa today where there's a preference for larger families. Almost literally a preference where, in parts of Nigeria where we film, there was a sense of pride, the greater number of sons that you would produce. The first demographic transition demographers describe is when that flips, and it flips very quickly from being a case of wanting more children to fewer well-educated children. So once education becomes an option because you no longer need your children, often it's linked to simple things like running water is brought to a village, or that the children are not needed to do chores in the way they were. And suddenly it becomes a case of, well, let's focus on education, and that requires resources and time. And then we settle on this typical number, and the typical number is 2 or 3. And that seems pretty universal. Of course, some have more. Of course, some have 1. But interesting, the proportion of women having 1 child, really hasn't been increasing at all, as I mentioned earlier. But also, I saw a survey which seemed pretty robust recently, whereby they were asking ideal family sizes, and even those parents and people who were single and parents with 1 child strongly recommended having 2 or more. So that doesn't seem to be usually a choice. So 2 or 3 is really where most countries are today, and I would say comfortably 70% plus of families have two or more children. Now, people may be listening to this thinking, well, I want 4, or I want 6. Yes, of course that happens, but 2 or 3 seems to be a common number. And I think the reality is that, as a parent of 3 myself, once you have the first one, having a second one is not as challenging, and then you have this situation where they play together, and the elder one can actually teach the younger one, and then the third one was not so difficult having done that. So it all comes down. But one sensing from you, perhaps, is at your age, naturally, there's perhaps a curiosity as to perhaps what it is or when it will be that you get this desire to have a child. I think nature and life will take care of that. I think there'll be a moment, and it very probably is going to be linked to when society around you is having, when your peers, when your friends, your family members having children. And you're right, by the way, you mentioned earlier, there is, an argument from people I've heard that, I'll call it, Mary Eberstadt being one on podcast, where she believes that if you haven't been exposed to people who have children, it's much less likely that you will get that, innate desire. But as soon as you see someone in your close friend group or your family having a young baby, that something kicks in, at least for women. So maybe indeed that is a concern here as societies kind of thin out, that the opportunity to do that becomes less. And gosh, fighting against nature and these things can be, nature. It may turn out to be that nature's not very forgiving to societies that don't prioritize having children. I guess that might make sense.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating there because in, for example, being part of a church, I found that friends there will be older than me, but they'll be getting married or having kids, and then compared to people friends that are not in that kind of community, it's just a different kind of perception, and I'm kind of torn between it, because on the one hand I'm seeing people who it's kind of like, oh wait, wow, that's a possibility, and that definitely changes and updates the way you think about things. I wanted to touch on something you talked about earlier about why this is going on, and how you have shocks like the 1971 oil crisis and 2008. Why were there not these kinds of shocks like before? Before the 60s, there was increasing population, and just generally, why do we have these kinds of instances where suddenly people start delaying having children, or is that the case?
Yeah, well, just so the recent phenomenon is that we as societies have been able to function and and grow while deferring parenthood, maybe because of deferring parenthood. In the past, that didn't happen. So there were shocks, of course. There were many. There were wars, there were pandemics. But that didn't lead to people choosing to defer having children into their 30s, which is what we see now. Part of that may be indeed due to the ability to contraception. I'm sure played a role. Contraception is not entirely new, and interesting. In Japan, we see that the pill, first of all, was not made available until 1990. 2 or more decades after other developed nations, and yet birth rates fell there too. So I think contraception can only explain part of this. So in the past, you went through shocks, but after the shock, society reverted to doing what it had done before, which was for most people having children in their 20s or maybe even earlier. The difference now is that through these shocks, it has led to us re-engineering societies so that it becomes normal to start our families late 20s or nowadays into our 30s. And that's when we start fighting against this fertility window and all of the probabilities that increasingly mount against us in terms of having that partner who wants a child at the right time. So the difference is and let's just continue this a little bit, because what is it that was happening in the 70s, say in Japan, when people without children decided to defer having a child through the uncertainty? Well, women were going into the workplace. They were pursuing education. They didn't just sit around for a year or 2 or 3 doing nothing. There were things to do. And that's how society, reinvented itself. It became the norm for women to work. And, I'm before anyone gets angry, I'm never going to support anyone who wants to wind the clock back in any shape or form. I'm a big supporter of my daughter educationally as much as my sons, and that goes for any young woman. But what we've ended up with is effectively, women being cast into a man's, education, work-life environment, and it's not working. It's simply not working. And the fact that we've got so many people who wanted to have children not being able to do so in their 30s after they've gone through this period of education after they've established their careers entirely normal. That's what we as societies are telling young women to do. But we're not telling them, and it's interesting. Educationally, we tell women about how not to get pregnant. That's common education material in biology classes from high school upwards. But we're not telling them about this fertility window at all in any significant way. In fact, we're almost misleading them, I would argue. And that, I'm not sure the reason for that. But in terms of solutions here, the solution is not winding the clock back in terms of education careers for women. To me, it has to be, if there is an option, about much more flexible education and much more flexible careers. Why shouldn't we start our career? Start at age 30. That's possible today, but it's taking a very big risk, a lot of vulnerability there. Why do we study for 3-4 years intensely in something that we may not actually end up doing career-wise? So why not study for a part-time degree for 2 years? Let's call it a certificate diploma that we then, come back to complete with the option to vary whatever our master's might be or our primary subject might be. Once we're really sure what we actually want to focus on, and why in those intervening years, why isn't it made easier for us to have the children we want to have? And given that, retirement is, the idea that we're going to continue to retire at current ages, we're going to be working, like it or not, well into our 70s. Very likely, young people today are going to be looking at some form of work into their 80s to be able to sustain themselves because of the shrinkage of the workforce. We'd be foolish to think otherwise. So we're going to have long careers. If you start a career at age 30, you still got the best part of 40 years of a career to build. So these are the conversations that I think we need to be having.
Yeah, I like thinking about some more, radical sounding ways to do things because as you say, maybe it's not that radical because everything is so kind of new, having all this education, years and years of it up front. And then, as you say, people choosing a degree at 18, and then like it seems invariably that people change what they want to do. And so thinking about like changing, society completely to try and foster and sort of facilitate having families. I like, so it's interesting there you mentioned that, we might have to sort of be working till we're much older. What kind of are then the impacts when you have like falling population levels in an economy, in a country?
Yeah, so, the vast majority of healthcare costs are spent on the elderly. I forget the precise number, but in the UK, I saw recently for the NHS, I think it might be 60% of all NHS costs go in the over 75s. It might even be a higher percentage than that. We also have the cost of state pension, the national pensions around the world. And what most people don't know, because I didn't fully appreciate it until this project, was that the pension money that we are putting in is not for our own benefit. It's not a saving for us. Our current taxes or whatever way it's funded, those go towards paying for those who are retired today. And as long as there are at least as many, or ideally more, workers, over time, that can work. It's not a Ponzi scheme because with that balance, there's always going to be enough workers. You have this pyramid with relatively few older people. Well, two things happen. First of all, people started living longer. It's made that much of a difference. That's made a little bit of a difference for sure. But once you then start contracting the workforce compared to the number of older people, that just eats away at the available tax resources to be able to take care of the older people. The result is going to be a worsening of quality of life for older people. We will not be able to sustain the level we have today in terms of pensions, social care, and medical needs. There won't be taxes to do it. and at the same time increasing taxes on younger people to try and support the older people, despite the fall in quality of life. So everyone loses here. No one wins. So one way around that is, or one way to ameliorate that, would be to have people retire later, so that they have their own resources for a longer period of time, and that retirement window is less. We're going to be seeing that more and more. And whilst there are protests against any increase in retirement age, I think we saw that in France a year or so ago, where I think the retirement age went up to 63 or something. If you're young today, that's a fantasy. That's a complete fantasy. You can make no assumption whatsoever that the state will be there to provide you with very much at all. No. There's another side to this, and that may sound really gloomy for younger people having to work, so long. Well, reality is that retirement, that I sense for many, is not that glamorous thing. I mean, the idea you go from working 9 to 5 or whatever it is today, or whatever it will be in the future. The idea that you kind of at a certain moment in time stop work and perhaps do what? Sit in the sofa and watch, I don't know, pay TV, or we have this vision that we're going to be hanging out with our friends, we're going to go golfing, we're going to take vacations. Yeah, there's a bit of that, perhaps in our younger years. But as we get older, certainly into late 70s, 80s, 90s for many, days start to become slower and slower. So the idea of sudden retirement, I think, doesn't help with mental health either. And I don't think it's going to be the case that we continue to work doing the exact same form of jobs that we've done in the preceding decades. I think there's going to be there ought to be a gradual phasing out of the work that we've done, and perhaps, in some sense, almost a retraining to do some other work. Someone described recently in Japan, 80-year-olds who are kind of doing some handicraft in their home a few hours a week. And I think that's a healthy thing for people to have some purpose, to have a connection with community, and not just left isolated on their own. So this is the way we're going to have to start to think.
I've kind of really enjoyed this conversation, and there's no specific direction I kind of want to take it now. So is there any final thing you'd want to add to flesh anything out, anything you think we've missed? And if not, what is your future going to look like?
Well, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to, I think a lot of the terminology and the way we look at fertility and birth rates, it has not been helpful. And for me, realizing that we really don't have falling birth rates, to think of it that way is really missing the point. Motherhood has changed for decades. The issue is childlessness, and I call it unplanned childlessness. For me, it's the best term that I've come up with. Some people call it involuntary childlessness. That sounds a medical thing, and how can you involuntarily not do something? It kind of is a double negative to me. I'd love people to be calling this unplanned childlessness. I think it speaks to the point that often people just go through life and suddenly, they find themselves childless. I like the term BirthGap. I came up with that as a way to describe this gap between the number of older people to support and the number of younger people, this gap in the age group. I think that, so people, come up and say things like, well, what about, aren't there too many people in the world? I would just say, well, how are we going to solve the birth gap? And it starts a conversation, the gap between old and young, etc. So I'd love to see a shift in terminologies and focus on the things that really matter here. In terms of me, what I'm doing next, well, the documentary was part one of trying to ultimately increase awareness and solve this problem. I live in Japan. I'm not sure we mentioned that, but I'm here to try and see if we can figure out a way for Japanese people, those young people who want the children, to have the children they want to have and stabilize the birth there, and for that to become a template for other nations around the world. And, in between times, there'll be more editions of the documentary coming out, and a book sometime this year too.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the time. Enjoy.
Thank you.